The second part of the lecture on Chapter 5 looks more specifically at spirituality as it relates to the diverse populations in our society and really around the world for that matter, and also implications for social work practice and assessment. One thing I will mention to you that strikes me as rather odd for a textbook written in 2017 is that there isn't any. We don't look at Muslim Americans, and I just find that to be rather surprising, given the fact that the Muslim American population is growing. And when we talk about spirituality, there's certainly a lot of things there for us to learn and understand. So I just would point that out to you and suggest to you that you maybe do some other research about this, if particularly if you're going to wind up interacting with that population in your practice. Now, in general, I think it can be said that formal religion, organized religion, has had a very mixed view of a mixed involvement, I suppose, a mixed influence on the existence of minority groups and their attainment of social justice. Historically speaking, as well as in the present day, many organized religions limit the involvement of minority groups or exclude them from certain practices in their religion, and even so much as calling some of their behaviors sinful, that kind of thing. And so on one hand, organized religion can be very impeding in terms of social justice for various groups, but historically speaking, and perhaps even in the present day, many organized religions are very involved in social justice causes and social movements, including things like the civil rights movement and the abolition of the death penalty, anti-poverty movement, and so on. And so when we talk about spirituality and religion in this particular discussion, keep in mind that there are both positive and negatives in terms of organized religion for these groups. Now, one thing I must add to this is that I really hesitate to talk about groups in such general terms as the next few slides are going to do. First of all of these groups are made up of a number of different cultural groups that see things very differently, just like if we were to have a slide up here and say Caucasians do this in regards to religion, a lot of Caucasians say, wait a minute, there's a lot of different kinds of cultural influences among Caucasians and a lot of different beliefs and attitudes. And the same is true for African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans and on and on. So take these next few slides as really gross generalizations, but information that's useful in a larger sense, perhaps, but this is certainly not necessarily the case for your clients on an individual basis. But for African Americans, the text points out that as a group they tend to be they have higher levels of involvement in organized religions. I believe the text says that the largest percentage of African Americans belong to the different Protestant churches. But in any of all the groups in the United States, this is the one group that's most likely to identify itself as involved in some formal religion. Historically speaking, churches have been very important in the African American community, and it's evident obviously in some of the assaults on the African American consciousness, I guess, during the civil rights years, as well as in the present day and before the civil rights years, where the churches were a gathering place and a source of inspiration and leadership, and sometimes the bigots who were trying to scare off the African Americans would burn churches as a symbol of, I guess, their own resistance to the notion of equality. So the church is a very important institution in the African American community in many different ways. The central virtues of African American religions tend to believe in the connections in communities and mutual support, forgiveness of wrongs and oppression, social justice, sticking together through tragedy and tough times. For Latino Americans, spirituality has been affected by factors related to colonial history. The Europeans came and essentially enforced imposed the Roman Catholic religion upon the Native Americans, and in fact, the Roman Catholic Church continues to be a very dominant force in many, particularly Latin American countries, and in both North and South America. It's also been reported lately that there has been a rise in not only Roman Catholic churches, actually lost some membership in some Latin American countries, and there's been a rise in fundamentalist religions in those same countries. So that's probably got something to do. Rome, there's always some politics involved in whatever Rome does, and I think the fact that we have an Argentinian pope may suggest that the church recognizes that they're losing membership in Latin America. But in any event, the Latino Americans, their religions focus upon faith and ritual behavior, the holiness of Christ, reverence for Mary, recognition of saints. These are all things that are very closely involved and engaged with the Roman Catholic faith, and so this is where a lot of this grows from. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. This is such a broad spectrum of countries and cultures. It's almost kind of silly to try to lump them into one group like this, because there's such differences among them. However, it could be said that certainly there's a focus more upon the Eastern religions, I suppose, is how you would classify them: Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism. Now, here is a mention of Islam in here, but again, that there's nothing about this doesn't involve the Middle East, which is largely Muslim, and particularly given that our lecture earlier had talked about how the Muslims was the second largest religion around the globe. It just surprises to me that somehow this is overlooked in this chapter. But in any event, the Eastern religions tend to focus upon the connection among and the divinity of all beings, transcending suffering in the material world and displaying compassion, selflessness, and cooperation. There is a respect for elders among most of these groups that is over and above anything you see in other groups, and also an honoring of ancestors. So there's they connect to their heritage in that respect. Native Americans, their history. The Indian boarding schools is what's mentioned here first, and one of the things that has happened as those children were taken from reservations and in Alaska from the villages, and they were sent to boarding schools, ostensibly to improve their education, and to, education is one way of bringing somebody into a culture. Public education, part of the job of public education is to indoctrinate you into the beliefs of your country, your society. The Pledge of Allegiance in the morning is a good example of that, And so for those that were a part of the Native American culture living on reservations and in villages, mostly separate from the dominant culture, this is a way for the dominant culture to acculturate those children in that generation. But in the process of doing that, they were punishing children for speaking their native language and for eating the native foods and not being allowed to practice their traditional religions. But instead, again, Christian missionaries were very involved in the establishment and the running of these schools. Father Michael Alexa, I probably have mentioned him in earlier lectures. He's somebody who, if you ever have a chance to hear him speak, I encourage you to do that, because he's really very dynamic, and he really understands how the dominant culture clashes with the cultures of the villages in and around Alaska. And he told a story one time about a pilot who would fly children back and forth between the villages to the boarding schools wherever they were going. and how, as he would fly them out of the village and they said goodbye to their families, they would cry because they were leaving their community and, going into an unknown. And then, at mid-year or at the end of the year when it was time for them to go back to the village for break or for summer, he said those same kids would cry because they were going back to the village because they just didn't feel like they were a part of that culture any longer. And that's a part of the dilemma, I think, that this acculturation has caused, and a part of what is lost for those children and those cultures, of course, has been the religion, which is the whole idea of spirituality is inseparable from native life. And well, for a lot of native children adopted into white families, for instance, where those families may not be aware of that, it's often the source of a lot of psychological problems. And so anyway, connection and responsibility to the earth and all its creatures, the sacredness of all things in the world. There's really an aversion to waste, and particularly when it comes to hunting and animals and those kinds of things. There's a very important connection with extended family and community. A lot of use of myth and ritual and storytelling as spiritual practices as well. So these are just some of the hallmarks of spirituality with Native American population, not only in Alaska, but all over the United States. Going into another area, we'll look at sex and gender and diversity. And women are more likely than men to report that they're religious, that they frequently use prayer, that they feel close to God, that they're church affiliated, and that they're certain in their belief of God, and that hold a positive view of the church and more religiously engaged. Women basically, are more engaged in the church and more active in using the various parts of the church in their daily life. But in many denominations, women's participation is restricted quite a bit, and they're prohibited from holding leadership positions or performing parts of the religious rites and ceremonies. Again, just referring back to the church that I know, the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, women are not allowed to be priests, and that's been a sore spot for the last 50 years in America. The American Catholic Church and the women in it, many of the women have really challenged that, but the church holds firm on that. And women members of traditional Judeo-Christian and Islamic faiths generally experience conceptualizations of the divine as masculine. God is he. So this suggests somehow that men are closer to God than women are. If you ever want to test that theory out in a conversation with another person and bring up the subject of God and refer to God as a she and see what the reaction is, that'll tell you very clearly, very quickly, just how much the masculine is more deeply valued and honored in the church, at any church. The LGBT community has particular problems with many organized religion these days, and really kind of suffer at some of those groups that, on the one hand, that preach social justice and inclusion, yet on the other hand, still want to relegate the LGBT community to a particular section of the congregation that really may not fully participate in the religion altogether. And there's a lot of literature that covers the impact of this rejection on that community, including depression and internalized shame, a higher rate of substance abuse, thoughts of suicide, spiritual loss, those kinds of things. When you're working with another group, a particular group, when you're working with LGBT youth as well, these issues may be, even more enhanced because of the fact that many of them are suffering some rejection by their family and their peers as well. This population in general, I think, is experiencing more acceptance in our society than, say, 20 years ago. But the institutions of the society, in many respects, are lagging behind. So and certainly in terms of organized religion, this is one area where I think this population suffers quite a bit. And now there are some churches that specifically welcome and accept the LGBT community, but they're pretty few and far between. There are some religious teachings that interpret disability as punishment for the sins of a person or the family. It's sadly true. But by the same token, spirituality is something that can really be a means of coping and path to positive self-determination for differently abled persons as well. By the same token, the elderly population is another group that find a lot of social support, or at least turn to the church to organize religion for social support, and spirituality perhaps becomes much more important for older persons as they move closer towards the end of their life and have to deal with a lot of issues regarding their health and the loss of loved ones around them. Studies have showed spirituality is an inverse relation with such things as depression, anxiety, hopelessness, suicide, and other mental health problems. In other words, the more spirituality is a part of an individual's life, the less likely these things are likely to show up. And by the same token, it's shown to have a positive relationship with higher self-esteem and a sense of self-efficacy, hope and optimism, satisfaction, and generally a sense of well-being. That is probably not too surprising. As far as the connection between spirituality and physical health is concerned, I think we touched on this a little bit in the chapter on biological person, but spirituality is linked to, I think actually that chapter was probably talking more about participation in religion, but spirituality in general is linked to a variety of better health outcomes. And there's some very clear linkages between, for instance, psychological stress and lowered immune system functioning. And so if you consider that spirituality is, has a hand in lowering stress levels, or and in making an individual feel more effective as an individual, have a higher degree of self-efficacy, like we were just talking about, then it'd be fairly clear that spirituality would help with our health. Meditation is one of those. We're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but it's an alternative intervention, meditation, and it connected to Eastern religion and Eastern religious thought in some respects, but it's really a very good method for deep relaxation. And there have been lots of studies to show that, way back when I was taught transcendental meditation many years ago, and we were shown studies then. Time Magazine, in fact, was reporting studies that show a connection between meditation and not just a lower blood pressure during meditation, but permanently lowering blood pressure and those kinds of things in an individual. There are studies that link the experiences the individual has in meditation to brain function alteration. That again, considering that this becomes in Western ways of thinking, at least, a deep relaxation technique, can be very effective and is going to lower stress and likely improve health. And that, again, that's I think a fairly obvious connection there. Studies show that the positive workings of the mind are a trainable skill. Through practices such as that, we can teach people to get their brain functioning in different ways to help them be healthier. Religion and spirituality support health-promoting behaviors, discourage risk behaviors. There have been studies to suggest that with adolescents, for instance, that those young people delay their sexual involvement with other people. Those that are more spiritual and more actively engaged in religions and spirituality are likely to have fewer partners, those kinds of things. Other studies indicate possible biological processes that mediate the negative impacts of stress and support healthy immune functioning with spirituality and religion once again. Just to, for whether it's mental health issues or physical health, the spirituality and religion have been noted in many studies to be a major means of coping and thus stress reduction. So, it can be applied to all levels of human systems, not just the individual, but to families. And I think there's some talk about the use of spirituality in working with families, communities, organizations, and societal levels. The TM Society, I chuckle when I say that, and I shouldn't really, but the TM trainers used to tell us that they were... they really truly believe that our society would change if they could get the majority of Americans meditating. It was in those days, it was Americans supposed to meditate 20 minutes twice a day. I think that's changed actually now, but with the TM Society. But in any event, the notion was the more people that were meditating, the more not more relaxed our society would be, the healthier it would become, and the outlooks would be different. This is the alternative medicine intervention I was referring to earlier, the CAM, or complementary and alternative medicine interventions, a group of diverse medical and healthcare systems, practices, and products that are not generally considered to be part of conventional medicine. Meditation would be part of that. Homeopathy, neuropathic medicines, or naturopathic medicines rather, those kinds of things. They're very controversial sometimes for individuals who are getting traditional medical treatment, but you find people turning to them, particularly in times when the medical community doesn't offer a lot of hope for whatever reason. Stressors alter our body at the cellular and molecular level and diminish our health in that respect. So, engaging in creativity, which I think is a part of spirituality, certainly facilitates spiritual growth and well-being because it encourages the person to go beyond their usual limits and to tap into strengths of sources of strength and self-expression that they really weren't in touch with before. And in terms of, here it talks a little bit about family life in the spiritual dimension. It can be very important in helping families work through many different issues as listed here, discord, health issues, death and loss, challenges of adoption, those kinds of things. So the spiritual assessment is something that the authors recommend that we work into our practice with individuals. Depending upon your employer, there could be some, particularly if you're working for a government agency or whatever, it could be some backlash against talking about doing spiritual assessments with your clients, and this is something that I think because again, separation of church and state is the obvious reason for that, but also because generally it's not accepted, and in a lot of respects, spirituality isn't recognized as an important aspect of life by much of Western culture, at least a lot of American culture, and so the mainstream, that is, of our thinking. And so this is something that you want to work into your practice, but you also want to be sure you have spoken with your superiors about it if you're working in an agency, and where it fits in the bigger picture, so that there's no confusion about that. And part of this is, and this is something I touch on another slide or two, but this idea that you're not, in doing spiritual assessments, you're not trying to impose your religion on a client. You're just trying to learn more about the role of spirituality in that client's life. So gathering that information and assessing spiritual development and current interests are important, and the authors believe just as important as getting information about biopsychosocial factors. The transpersonal is an important part of our existence. But we have to go beyond simply asking, those basic questions. What church, what religion do you belong to? Do you go to church regularly? Are you engaged in, any activities in the community related to your church? And really looking at I think, deeper questions or whatever, um, what kinds of things are most important and meaningful to you when you deal with conflicts, what brings you meaning and purpose and connection, those kinds of things. Really kind of plunge into the deeper aspects of spirituality. And want to look in your assessment at both the positive and the negative aspects of clients' religious and spiritual beliefs and practices. And to be able to distinguish between what is a religious or spiritual problem and a mental disorder. And we talked about that some in the last lecture. And you just kind of touched on it a little bit. And that's something that I think really does require more training and study. So there are some examples of questions for what's called an implicit spiritual assessment, where you're not sitting down and saying, I want to know about your spiritual health now, so I'm going to ask you these questions. But these are questions that you can kind of glean information about a client's spirituality by these questions, which really are not directly related to religious practice so much as it is a client's spiritual belief system. So I'm experiencing a little bit of problems with my recording program, and I am going to try to attach this to the end of the lecture I've just recorded on part 2 so far. But if I do that, it'll be all one lecture. If I don't, this is going to be part 3, much to my chagrin. But I think I can probably connect these two. And really, there are just a few slides left about the implications of all of this for social work practice. And so these are things that I think kind of help us figure out what exactly we're supposed to do with this information in terms, or what are the implications, at least, of the information for us when we work with clients. And for one thing, I think this is an important role, or important point, it's just to maintain some clarity about your role as a spiritually sensitive practitioner, and making a distinction between being a worker who includes focus on spiritual dimensions as a part of practice in general, and not as a religious leader, spiritual director, or a proselytizer. And I have run into poorly trained workers, or people that are doing social work that aren't trained in social work at all, who really do try to, for lack of better terms, try to save their clients through some of their practice, almost as a preacher or something. And my advice to those individuals is that they really ought to be in a church preaching and not out there working cases. But particularly, again, when, I was just mentioning a few moments ago, is that, if there's a point where you need to be able to explain this to, whether it's superiors in your practice, your coworkers, members of the community, whatever it might be, about why it is you're going into these areas, that really this is an important distinction. Is you're not trying to direct anybody's religion or win anybody over into a church or anything, but or tell them what's right or wrong, but just really trying to assess the role of spirituality in their life, and to try to make use of those parts of their spirituality that might help them get healthier and better. We need to be respectful of different religions and spiritual paths, and also have an openness to learning about the role and meaning of various beliefs and practices and experiences that we may not even consider to be valid, or that we may have questions about ourselves. We have to stay open-minded if we're going to be good practitioners in this area. We should examine our own beliefs and values and biases about religion and spirituality, and take a look at how it is that will impact our approach to this topic, and our approach to clients who are more or less engaged in spirituality themselves. We should be aware for every client, and particularly those that belong to minority groups, but everyone in general, both the positive and the negative role religion and spirituality has played in the life of their group, and be sensitive to the history that is involved with that. Should develop a working knowledge of the beliefs and practices frequently encountered in your work with clients, especially those of newly arriving immigrants or refugees from groups that are, not a dominant group in our society. Like for instance, Buddhist beliefs is one of the things that they mentioned here, or spiritual traditions of First Nations peoples. We should conduct a comprehensive spiritual self-assessments with clients and use the information in service planning and delivery to continue to be trained and acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to employ spiritually based intervention techniques appropriately, ethically, and effectively. And again, if I may say this non-denominationally, you're not practicing these skills or using this knowledge to intervene to bring people into your belief system or to any belief system, but rather to utilize their belief systems, their spirituality in promoting their own well-being and their health. Find out information about various religious and spiritual organizations that are pertinent to the practice and develop good working relationships with those resources so that you can refer and collaborate. And collaboration is an important area in this. If you can find individuals in various spiritual groups and things around your community, cultivate a relationship with them and let them know that you want to learn from them and all in the service of clients that you're going to encounter. And that will do a lot to raise your image in the minds of those individuals and those other organizations, and probably is going to result in you getting referrals from the community. And finally, and this is something I think is true in all of these topics, is engage in ongoing self-reflection about what brings purpose and meaning and connection in our own lives. If we don't consider ourselves to be spiritual individuals, remember, again, spirituality separated from religious involvement. Perhaps we're all spiritual individuals, I believe, on one level or another. But in any event, effort should be made to understand what you believe about this, develop your spirituality as you see fit, however you define the process, and know how all of this impacts you and may impact your work with clients. Okay, so that's all I have to offer with this, and I hope that you gain some information from these 2 lectures, or maybe 3 lectures that are of some benefit to you. Let me know if questions arise, and we'll take it from there. Okay, see you next week.